Madam President, yesterday, USA Today and the Pew Research Center released a new poll that found Americans by more than a 2-to-1 margin are dissatisfied with the direction that the country is going. 62% of Americans rate their personal financial situation as poor or fair, and a whopping 65% want the next president to pursue policies different from those of the current president. Madam President, what I would suggest is that the American people are tired. They're tired of seeing their bills go up while their paychecks don't. They're tired of having to work harder just to stay in place, to say nothing of getting ahead. And they're tired of economic promises that are often repeated but never fulfilled. Our economy has supposedly been in recovery for years, but it's a recovery that feels a lot like a recession to ordinary, hardworking Americans. Nearly 10 million Americans are currently unemployed. More a third of them have been out of work for more than 6 months. Now, while unemployment finally declined last month, the decline was driven more by the fact that 806,000 Americans dropped out of the workforce entirely than by any meaningful surge in the number of those who are employed. Had the number of Americans participating in the labor force stayed flat last month, the unemployment rate would have actually gone up, not down. In fact, if the labor force participation rate today were the same as it was when President Obama took office, our nation would have an unemployment rate today of 10.4%. So what's happening is more and more people are leaving the labor force. They're completely discouraged. But the labor force participation rate has fallen, and one of the main reasons it's fallen is because so many Americans have grown so discouraged that they've given up looking for work entirely. Madam President, our country has experienced recessions before, but we've always bounced back. But our recovery from this recession has been so slow, at times seemingly non-existent, that many are wondering if the last 5 years of sluggish growth and recession-level unemployment could be the new normal. And they're right, it could be, if we continue the policies of the last 5 years. Madam President, the widespread dissatisfaction with the economy reflected in the Pew poll may not be what Democrats want to see, but it's the natural outcome of their policies. They've spent 5 years pursuing policies that have not only been unsuccessful in creating jobs, but have all too frequently actually hurt job creation. Take Obamacare. It's hard to even know where to start when talking about the damage Obamacare is wreaking on jobs and the economy. There's the Obamacare tax on life-saving medical devices like pacemakers and insulin pumps, which has cost thousands of jobs in this industry already and is going to cost thousands more. There's the 30-hour work week rule, which has forced businesses, state and local governments, and nonprofits to cut the hours of workers in this country. There's the employer mandate, which has caused many businesses to rethink their plans to expand and hire new workers. And then, of course, there's the burden the law places on small businesses. The title of an article that appeared in the Las Vegas Review Journal over the weekend summed it up nicely, and the headline went like this: "Own a small business, brace for Obamacare pain." This article pointed out something that's often overlooked in discussions of the law, that the people who will suffer the most from the small business health plan cancellations that Obamacare will cause in Nevada and around the country are those who can least afford it, the kind of people the law was supposed to help. Some workers, and I quote, the article states, are at higher risk than others of losing company-sponsored coverage. Professional, white-collar companies, such as law or engineering firms, will bite the bullet and renew at higher prices. But, it goes on to say, moderately skilled or low-skilled people making $8 to $14 an hour working for landscaping businesses, fire prevention firms, or fencing companies could lose work-based coverage because the plans cost so much relative to salaries, end quote. That's right, Madam President. It's low-income workers in places like Nevada who stand in the greatest danger of losing their employer-sponsored coverage. And that's frequently the story when it comes to the Democrats' so-called job-creating policies. Democrats like to suggest that Republicans are indifferent to workers' plights and that only Democrats really have a plan to offer help. But in fact, Democrats' plans to help often pose the most danger to low-income workers. There's Obamacare, of course, as I mentioned, but there's also the minimum wage proposal, which the Congressional Budget Office says will eliminate up to 1 million jobs. And those 1 million jobs will be eliminated These aren't doctors' jobs. They're not lawyers' jobs. They're positions held by low-income workers who will be the first to suffer when employers have to cut back on hiring or hours as a result of a minimum wage hike. And then, of course, there's the Keystone Pipeline, which we're talking a little bit about today, which the President has resolutely refused to approve, despite the fact that it would support, according to his own State Department's estimate, 42,000 jobs without spending a dime of taxpayer money. The people who will be hurt the worst by the President's decision to cow to the relentless pressure of far-left environmentalists are the workers who would actually build the pipeline and the restaurants and the small businesses who would benefit from pipeline workers' business during construction. And Mr. President, Madam President, it's not just Keystone. Almost all of the President's energy policies would do serious damage to our economy and to working Americans. Take the restrictions on ground-level ozone levels that the President's EPA is scheduled to release by December of this year. In 2010, the EPA proposed lowering the permitted ozone levels from 75 parts per billion to 60 to 70 parts per billion. Energy industry estimates suggest that lowering the ground-level ozone concentration to 60 parts per billion would cost businesses, get this, more than $1 trillion per year. $1 trillion per year between 2020 and 2030. Job losses as a result of this measure would total a staggering 7.3 million by 2020, devastating entire industries, most especially U.S. manufacturing. My own state of South Dakota would lose tens of thousands of jobs in manufacturing, natural resources, and mining on construction. And just to take a look at what this would actually do, these are the areas under these proposals that have been put forward. And today there are probably a couple hundred counties in the country that are not in compliance, that are what we call non-attainment areas, and mostly urban, heavily populated areas of the country. But if you take a look at what their proposal would do, Madam President, on this map right here represents those who would be affected if you went to 60 parts per billion as opposed to the 75 parts per billion today. So instead of focusing on those counties in this country who are not currently in attainment and getting them to full attainment first, we're talking about expanding dramatically the impact that this would have all across the country. Look at my state of South Dakota, for example. We'd have areas that wouldn't be in attainment. We don't think of South Dakota as being a place where we have problems with clean air, ozone issues, but this is clearly a regulation which, if put into effect, would cost the economy literally billions and billions of dollars, and one estimate, $1 trillion per year between 2020 and 2030. Madam President, if you look at where this hurts people the most, again, it's the people that are going to be the lower and middle income Americans, the people whose budgets are most heavily affected by hikes in their energy bills. Now today the President's going to hold press events to raise alarm about climate change and push for more job-killing, industry-crippling energy policies. But it'll be interesting to see if he spares a line or two for the millions of Americans whose jobs would be lost and whose household budgets would be shattered as a result of his proposals. Madam President, this week the Senate's going to be considering the Shaheen-Portman energy legislation. Now, I plan to introduce 3 amendments to check EPA overreach and to protect American workers from the devastating effects of the EPA's ground-level ozone and greenhouse gas proposal. The first amendment will require Congress to vote up and down on any EPA regulation that has an annual cost of more than $1 billion. Pretty straightforward. Let the people's representatives vote. If you're going to put regulations out there that are going to cost more than $1 billion, let's have Congress vote on those. The second amendment would prohibit the EPA from finalizing greenhouse gas regulations for new and existing power plants if the Department of Energy and the GAO determine that those regulations will raise energy prices or cost jobs. So if the Department of Energy and the GAO determine the regulations will not impact jobs or energy prices, the EPA could go forward and finalize those regulations. It is time to be honest with the American people about the cost of these regulations. Taken together, these 2 amendments are a strong step toward placing a check on EPA's regulatory train wreck. The final amendment I'll offer, Madam President, is specific to the administration's upcoming proposal on ground-level ozone, which I, as just mentioned, is the most expensive regulation in EPA's history. The cost of this regulation is so great that when the EPA first proposed lower levels in 2010, the White House delayed those regulations until after the President's reelection. Now, my amendment's straightforward. First, it would require the EPA to consider the costs and feasibility of new ozone regulations. Many Americans would be surprised to know that the EPA isn't even allowed to consider costs when setting these new regulations. Well, my amendment would fix that. Additionally, my amendment would force the EPA to focus on the worst areas of smog before dramatically expanding this regulation to the rest of the country. And as I mentioned on the map here, 221 counties across 27 states don't even meet the current standard of 75 parts per billion. It makes sense to focus on these urban areas before expanding ozone regulations to areas like western South Dakota, where we clearly don't have a smog problem. Under my amendment, 85% of these counties would have to achieve full compliance with the existing standard before the EPA could move forward with a lower level that dramatically expands the reach of ozone regulations. I hope that the Senate will get the chance to vote on these proposals. I also hope the Senate will get a chance to vote on the Keystone Amendment so that we can get those 42,000 jobs opened up to American workers. It's been a real long time since we've had a real energy debate in the Senate. But given the sluggish economy and the danger that the President's energy proposals pose to any future growth, I'm hoping that the Majority Leader will decide it's time for a debate. Madam President, the election year agenda offered by Democrats and the President is just more of the same job-killing, growth-stifling legislation the Democrats have been offering for the past 5 years. And like the legislation that Democrats and the Presidents have offered for the last 5 years, it will do the worst injury to the Americans who can least afford it. Madam President, pundits may warn that our current economic malaise is the new normal, but it doesn't have to be that way. We can get the economy going again. We can lift the heavy burden of government regulation and free up businesses to grow and to create jobs. And we can make it easier, not harder, for middle-class workers to find stability and for lower-income workers to make it into the middle class. Madam President, according to that Pew USA Today poll, 65% of Americans want the next president to pursue different policies. It's still a couple more years until the next presidential election, but there is no reason that Congress can't start pursuing different policies today. The American people have been struggling for long enough. Madam President, I yield the floor.